Hi, today I want to discuss some improvements to one of my projects on GitHub called gorm-standalone example. So I noticed that someone created a ticket on GitHub, and what he did basically, he tried to add two new fields to an existing domain class. Those two fields are date created and last updated, and he got some data integrity exceptions. So let's look at the report here. So here we see a property value exception, stack trace, shows blah blah blah. And the first reason why it's failing is because those two properties are not nullable inside the domain constraints. So the first thing that I did was to make sure that I could reproduce the problem. So I added two new fields, date created and last updated here. And if I go to the Grails documentation, it says that basically if you have two fields called date created or last updated inside your domain classes, Grails should automatically take care of dealing with the values of those fields. So I made sure that those two fields basically were set to nullable so that it would pass validation. And as soon as I did that, it didn't quite work because the value of those fields was never assigned. So I decided to take a look at gorm-interceptors to manually assign the value of those fields. So I created a before update closure, and initially I was only playing with the date. And I noticed that basically my before update closure was also never getting called. So I went back to look at the Gorm wiki about Gorm standalone, and I noticed something that I saw a couple of months ago, which is that if you want to use all those Gorm interceptors, you need to add an additional property to your Gorm session factory bean. So what I did, I read the documentation and I went back basically to my Spring beans definition file, and I tried to add a new property called event listeners inside the Gorm session factory bean. So for the key we would have, let's say, the event type, for example, pre-update, and here we have basically the listener that we want to attach. As soon as I did that, I got some weird exceptions, array store exceptions, not writable property exceptions, and so on. So I went, took a look at the Java docs of both Grails and Hibernate, and I tried to switch that property to Hibernate event listeners. It also didn't quite work, so I moved basically that property outside of the Gorm session factory, hoping that somehow Gorm would grab it and inject it. It also didn't quite work, so I was a bit stuck. So I ended up trying to use the Spring Bean post initialization processor to get the session factory and configure it after it was initialized. And I also failed. So my last attempt that was also successful was to create a simple class with some static methods. So what we want to do here is to grab the session factory, get a hold on the event listeners, and make sure that for each event listener type, we are able to add some additional values the same way that Gorm would do it inside the regular Grails application. So here we populate a hash map with some closure event triggering interceptors. And what we do, we take the original list. For example, here that would be event listeners dot flush event listeners, and we add some new values here. So everything inside the bracket in the array list here. So the code behind it is very simple. We get an event listener object, basically. We access the list of event listeners for a given type, and we add the list that we want to append. Once we are done creating our new list, we just reset the original property with our augmented list. As soon as I did that, everything was more or less okay, so I went back to take a look at my person domain object. I noticed that my before update closure was getting called, but still the date created field was never set. It was always null. So what I ended up doing is adding a new hibernate interceptor to set the value of that date created field. So the code behind it is very simple. So the implementation just grabs an entity, checks whether or not there is a date created property. If so, it tries to get the property type of the date created field if it's a date, and if the value is not set, we just assign a new date. The last thing that we want to do is make sure that that helper class is called inside our main class. So here, as soon as we are done initializing the Spring application context, we just want to be able to inject the default gorm interceptors and add some additional event listeners that will be able to trigger closure, to call basically our closures from our gorm domain classes. Sorry. So let's try to run the code. So if we look again back at what the example was all about, oops, the compilation failed, so let's see what's wrong. I forgot to save file. So let's go back to the main class. So we had two person domain objects, and only one instance should be persisted to the database, because if here is too small, we had some constraints. So the first name should be between 5 and 10 characters. And as soon as we are able to persist one domain object, we try to read the contents of the database, and we try to set the first name to Ludovic. But because we have a closure inside our domain class, before update event interceptor, it should be called. And as soon as we try to assign basically the value of the first name to Ludovic, it should reset it to Remero 1. Which means that after trying to update again the person that is inside our database, the first name will be changed from Remero to Ludovic, and then before it's persisted, it will be set to Remero 1. So when we fetch back the value from the database, the first name should have a value of Remero 1. So let's try to run the code. We also expect the value of the date created field and last updated fields to be populated automatically for us. So here in the console, we see that we only have one person saved. The date created field and last updated fields were populated correctly. And when we compare the values across changes, the date created field value was only set once, whereas the last updated field got updated across changes. I think that there is probably a better way than using a helper method here. So ideally, all that code should be just about setting a simple property at the gorm session factory level, and no code should be required. But this doesn't seem to quite work. Maybe I didn't investigate enough. But I believe that for 1 hour of work, it's reasonable, and it also doesn't involve basically that much code. Thank you.